Good afternoon and welcome to this, the 49th celebration of distinguished teaching at Berkeley. Go Bears! I'm Glenda Hull, chair of the Committee on Teaching this year, and I'm really happy to take part in today's ceremony, in which 5 teachers will be named distinguished teachers, joining 245 previous recipients since 1959. The Distinguished Teaching Award is the highest honor that this campus bestows to recognize excellence in teaching. And so the purpose of today's ceremony is to introduce and to honor the best of the best teachers on campus. I can promise you, you will leave today's event inspired and maybe just a little bit in awe of these teachers because they appear so effortlessly able to combine great knowledge in their fields with an equally big desire and an equally expansive capacity to share what they know inside their classrooms and beyond. And I think that this is the true distinction of a great research university to foster both the creation and the sharing of knowledge and expertise. I think of this ceremony also as a celebration of our students at Berkeley, and I'm glad to see so many students here today. We often say that there are no students like Berkeley students, and this is very true. They raise our greatest teachers to their tallest heights, inspiring and challenging them, and being inspired and challenged in kind. I hope today's award ceremony will also be an occasion for many of us here who are also teachers to reflect on this most important and rewarding activity in our professional lives. Right now at Berkeley, I feel a groundswell of new interest in teaching. We have, for example, a freshly constituted Center for Teaching and Learning, which is offering a range of supports around teaching. And there are lots of other initiatives as well. And in the best Berkeley tradition, there are also vigorous debates occurring. For example, about whether and how in this digital age, our traditions of excellence in the classroom can span time and space. So it's especially interesting and it's especially auspicious time to be engaged in teaching and to be reflecting on teaching here at Berkeley as we come together today to recognize and to celebrate and to learn from this year's 5 recipients of the Distinguished Teaching Award. So next I would like to introduce our Chancellor. It's my honor to introduce Robert Bourgeonneau, who will offer some thoughts about teaching at Berkeley from the very special vantage point that he has now, having been our Chancellor for the last 9 years and being on the eve of resuming his work again as a professor of physics and materials science and engineering. So, Chancellor Bourgeonneau.
Thank you so much, Glenda. It's great to be here again at this ceremony. This is, I have to say, in the life of the Chancellor, this is one of the very best ceremonies that you get to participate in. In fact, just last Saturday, I was welcoming about 5,000 admitted students and their parents to Cal. And most of my address was of course, telling the students what great parties they could go to, but also telling them, you know, what fantastic teaching they would get. And I gave a little vignette, sort of spontaneously, as I'm now doing, again spontaneously, because chancellors always like to brag, especially physicists, like to brag about how many Nobel Prizes our faculty have won. And I was telling them a story which has the virtue of being true, that sort of one of the customs I had, which I began at MIT, is whenever a faculty member would win a Nobel Prize, I would have some kind of special party for them. So George Smoot, when he won the Nobel Prize in 2006 in physics, on a Tuesday, and then by Thursday, Mary Kath and I had managed to organize an event at our house when we got all the other Nobel Prize winners and from around the Bay Area and distinguished people. And so we're having this wonderful dinner, and George is sitting beside me, and about 8:30, not that far into the dinner, I noticed he's getting more and more nervous and more restless. So finally I turned to him and said, George, sort of, what's wrong? So he said, well, I'm teaching freshman physics, and I have a class at 9 in the morning and I haven't prepared it. And literally George then peremptorily got up and just left the party and was gone. And that was it. And so I said, where else except Berkeley would someone who 2 days before had won the Nobel Prize in physics leave a celebration in his honor in order to prepare a class for freshman physics? There was no other university in the world where this could happen. The 5 individuals whom we're honoring today have not yet won their Nobel Prizes or Pulitzer Prizes, or et cetera, but they represent the best of Berkeley. Renowned researchers, engaged community scholars, and teachers who inspire their students. They come from a wide range of disciplines: integrative biology, history of art, comparative literature and French, bioengineering, and African American studies. Reading their statements about their philosophy of teaching is truly inspiring. The results of their efforts are clear in their students' praise. In particular, students mentioned these teachers' cultivation of an open and inclusive environment, inspiring them to speak up in class and challenge preconceptions. All of these teachers keep their content dynamic and up to date, whether it's sharing a lived experience, engaging with history and art, connecting new ideas to old literature or historical events to current politics, or keeping on top of the latest advances in science and engineering. Their courses have been so powerful as to inspire some students to switch majors as their focus of studies. Their teaching incites intellectual curiosity in students, engages them thoroughly in the enterprise of learning, and has a lifelong impact. Since this is my last Distinguished Teaching Award ceremony as Chancellor, won't be the last one I attend, I have to say, unfortunately, probably never as an awardee, because I always found research easy, but good teaching is really hard. It's easy to do good research, but to do good teaching, at least in my experience, that's a real challenge. And I'm in awe of people who are great teachers. Anyway, at one of these ceremonies, after we had convinced the Hewlett Foundation to give us this incredible gift of in the end, $13 million to create 100 new research chairs here at Cal. At one of these ceremonies, I realized, frankly, I had made a mistake, not in attracting the $113 million, but in how I set it up. And specifically, all 100 chairs were to recognize great researchers, frankly. And that was a mistake. And I realized that I should have segregated a certain number of them where the primary purpose of the chairs would be to recognize great teachers. And I'm pleased to say that, in fact, we managed to do that without making a formal announcement. And we now have a set of 10 distinguished chairs, some funded at the $3 million level, whose primary purpose is to recognize great undergraduate teachers at UC Berkeley. This set of teachers will form a collegium, which we're going to formally announce in late May. This concept the collegium first came from Christina Maslach, who was then, I guess, Vice Provost for Education, and was then followed up by a proposal from the Deans of Letters and Science, who wanted to host this. So the collegium is now in place. The model, which you'll hear a little bit about more later, will be these 10 chairs. The holders of the chairs will rotate, and they will be accompanied by 5 winners of the Distinguished Teaching Award. So we will have 15 great teachers who will form a collegium in the true sense that they will work together to help devise and inspire great teaching in all of the faculty. And along with the collegium goes an endowment, which will be significant in size as it grows, measured in 6-figure units, so hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, whose purpose will be to fund creative projects in undergraduate education. So I'm very excited about this, obviously, and I look forward to the members of the collegium teaching us how to do great teaching and inspiring new kinds of teaching among all of us. So, I want to note also that while we honor 5 of our colleagues today, indeed, we know there are many great teachers here at Cal. I always, as probably most of you know, I end up reading all of the tenure cases and all of the above scale cases here. And of course, the research cases are interesting. cross fields, research and scholarship. But the number of great teachers we have here at Cal is just absolutely inspiring. And therefore, finding yourselves among the 5 most distinguished teachers of the 2012-2013 year is, I think, just really extraordinary, and I want to personally congratulate all 5 of the awardees. So thank you for everything you do for Cal.
We're going to turn next to a film. So I invite you to sit back and enjoy what is a truly magical part of this ceremony every year. It's the film that was created this year by John Schenker from the Educational Technology Services. So prepare yourselves. You will be transported into the teaching worlds of each of our recipients.
My life has always been entrenched in formal education. When I was a young girl, my grandmother, she would always rewrite our speeches around Easter. And they were always very poetic. In fact, my grandmother didn't think it was a poem unless it was rhyming. And so, it was during, memorizing and reciting the poems that my grandmother wrote for me that I think I became aware of the rhythm of language.
As a kid, I was always a reader. One of the great things about studying literature is it takes you out of yourself. It brings you into dialogue not only with great writers across history, but with other communities of readers. You're reading the same thing that people have read for 2,000 years.
There's nothing more fun than talking about Machiavelli.
That's an extraordinary feeling, and I think I was hooked on that fairly early on.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about migration pathways. My entire undergrad degree was in marine biology, and I was convinced I was going to be a marine biologist. And then I decided I'd go on to graduate school, and a PhD came my way that was on a group of birds called sunbirds, which are from Africa, that I was fascinated in. And I did that, and I've never looked back since.
Ivory condition in the middle, those people are...
I was in grad school, and I saw what a professor's job was, but I didn't necessarily want to run a lab. But I liked part of it. I liked the teaching part.
We're interested in the X balance, so that's why we've drawn it this way.
Then I moved here for a full-time position in bioengineering.
I used to teach preschool, and I do think it informs my teaching. I really like to connect to each person. It's something you learn to do with 3-year-olds. They're very unique, each one.
We see Charles LeBrun pointing to what art should do.
And that assumption that everybody has something to give and deserves to be here is something I probably also learned in preschool.
My first lecture was a disaster. I was demonstrating some code, and it was supposed to loop and then spit out 16, and I had written it incorrectly, so it spit out 32. So I basically said, and as you can see, running the software, it adds up to 16, and then the hands start coming up. And I'm like, oh, yes. And I get to turn. Oh. Yeah, it would have done that had I correctly programmed it.
I still remember the first graduate seminar I taught at Berkeley. I started to give a presentation, and I got a few minutes into it, and hands started going up, and they started challenging me, and they kind of started ganging up at a certain point, and I thought, this is it. This is a real university, and I still remember that sense of exhilaration of knowing that whatever I said was going to be tested and challenged in some way by the students.
I was a graduate student when I gave my first lecture. The last little piece that we need to think about is, why do birds sing? And so I was extremely nervous to give this lecture. So I started lecturing, but my heart was pounding, and in my head, I knew I was speaking too fast. And then I was fortunate because about 5 minutes into the lecture, one of the students asked a really engaging question that sort of stopped me, and I had to really think about it. And then in answering that question, I realized, wow, this is actually going to be a two-way interaction between me and the students. It's not just me having to stand up here. And I think with that realization, I relaxed, and the whole process became a lot easier after that.
Remember, we were underscoring King and his nonviolent movement. UC Berkeley students are incredibly engaging. I think many of them have had experiences prior to coming to Cal where they shined in high school, perhaps they shined at their junior colleges, and so everybody is ready to shine in the classroom. And so it's easy to get a rhythm of conversation. And I think it's through the rhythm of conversation that people learn from one another. I learn from them, and it's where I think true learning happens.
I love it when a student asks me a question I'm completely unprepared for, and I need to pause and consider and figure out how to do it. That's just, as a personal challenge, that's fun.
It's extremely important in the classroom, it seems to me, to create a safe environment in which students feel that they can take risks. And one of the ways in which I can do that is by making it clear to them that I'm on a voyage of discovery myself.
I show some portraits of young Italian men in my introductory survey. Suddenly, one year, people started to laugh as a group at the portrait, and I said, I know he's coy and beautiful, but why are you laughing so hard? And it turns out he had his fingers in the formation of a kind of gangster code. And they were like, he's gangsta, you know?
By geometry, I can say that this distance...
I find Berkeley students to be very well-rounded. I'm impressed that you have people that are in a very challenging major, but have really interesting things going on in their life. You know, people that email me and say, I might be in the Olympics. I was wondering if I can, you know, be sure to get in your class an extra, you know, semester later. I'm not going to stand in the way of your Olympic hopes.
Diversity helps to remind us that there is a big world around us. We're living in Berkeley, we're attending Cal, and oftentimes it can almost feel like we're living in a bubble. If there is not diversity in the classroom, we lose out on so many different voices. We lose out on so many different ways of thinking about very critical questions. And more importantly, I think we lose out on the possibility of truly learning about one another.
When I first came here, teaching a work by a 17th century classical French playwright to a young man of Filipino-American descent who said, this play is about my grandparents. It's about family honor, it's about inheritance. This is my story. And to have that experience of a student who takes something away from a text and applies it to his own life and reads his own life in that work of literature, that's something that the students at Berkeley demonstrate again and again for me. And it's really an invigorating experience.
Sometimes you'll see more complicated systems.
I am definitely a nerd.
Questions?
I think that in our culture, showing enthusiasm for science is a little suspect. So if I can be somebody that stands up and waves my arms around, gesticulates wildly while they're lecturing, and is shameless in how interested I personally am in the material that we're working with, I think that that alone has value.
Going out in nature is what really makes the course what it is. Students will always be able to go and look up the facts. My ultimate goal is if I can teach them to think critically and I can impart an appreciation of the natural world, I've done well.
I want you to be able to contextualize their experiences. I think for me, one of the best ways in which to create a classroom where people feel safe to share who they are is because I share who I am.
Very few women were allowed into the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. They allow 4.
I'm always telling students, you can't go into a museum and expect to care about a lot of things you know nothing about. You know, some will strike you, but most won't. And that's why you have to do the work of finding out something about that art, that history. And then you're alert to what the stakes are.
I've really, over the years, come to believe that you can make a difference. And so there's nothing more rewarding than going to commencement and seeing the pride that students have in introducing their professor to their parents, or once they've graduated, out of the blue, knocking on my office door and saying, because of your course, I've fallen in love with birds and I've decided to go to graduate school. Those are awards that are just, I treasure every aspect of them. They're truly amazing. They're so fulfilling.
Well, I always say that serving on the Committee on Teaching, it's the best service on campus. How better could you spend your time than to sit in classrooms of the best teachers and learn about their art and craft in just exquisite detail? But I have to say a little bit about the difficult work of the committee as well. It is time-consuming and can seem arduous, but the most difficult part of the work is choosing among the excellent nominees that we receive each year, and that part is difficult indeed. So the selection process has two stages. It begins in October of each year when departments nominate one teacher and make a case for that nomination, including assembling lots of student evaluations. We select finalists from that pool, and then there's a second stage of the competition in which the departments and finalists put together a vast set of information to suggest the power of the teaching of the nominees. Many more teaching evaluations, but also letters are solicited from students and colleagues, and the nominees write a statement of teaching philosophy. But perhaps the most compelling part of stage two is when we get to visit as a committee the classrooms of the finalists. Each member visits the class of each nominee, and these are surprise visits, and they're wonderful for the committee. I don't know how exactly the nominees feel about them, but they're wonderful for the committee because it gives us a chance to juxtapose all this reading that we've been doing, the paper versions of their cases, with the real thing. And then when those observations are finished, we deliberate, and we deliberate long and hard. So I'd like to recognize the members of the Committee on Teaching this year who selected these recipients. First is Carl Brito from French and Comparative Literature, who will be helping to present the awards. Also, Ulla Hald from Mathematics, Juan Pestana from Civil and Environmental Engineering, David Shea from Computer Science and Electrical Engineering, and Andrew Garrett from Linguistics. Please join me in heartily thanking the members of this committee. All right, now we begin. I'm honored to introduce the first recipient of the Distinguished Teaching Award this year, Professor Rory Bowie. He changed the way I see and act in nature. An awesome professor, so funny and chill, but super knowledgeable and engaging. I used to dislike birds. I used to find them mildly boring at best. Now I love birds. No other class has made me change my view so drastically. Rory's brain contained so much information about birds, I don't know how he can fit anything else in there. He's a walking encyclopedia. Rory's enthusiasm is as contagious as his birding skills are impressive. He makes you want to be able to identify small birds. Based on only a short glance as they disappear into a tree. He makes you want to do this even after you've been standing in the rain for 3 hours on a cold February morning. Rory's the best, hands down. I have never had a professor who has been so nice, so knowledgeable, and so polite. Imagine your ideal professor. Imagine all those traits. Well, you've imagined Rory. Professor Bowie, who received his PhD from the University of Cape Town, is an assistant professor in the Department of Integrative Biology, and he's faculty curator of ornithology for the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology. That's impressive in and of itself, yes. An evolutionary biologist, he teaches courses that allow undergraduates a very precious opportunity to immerse themselves in the ecology, anatomy, natural history, and evolution of birds. In so doing, students learn how different components of biology fit together in the context of the whole organism and its environment. Professor Bowie epitomizes the marriage of excellent research characterized by astonishing productivity with excellent teaching characterized by compassion, respect, and reciprocity. On the one hand, this scientist has published in his short career 66 peer-reviewed papers, 50 of those since 2008. One colleague labeled him, quite literally, a force of nature in terms of his scientific productivity, a good metaphor. On the other hand, this teacher receives near-perfect scores on end-of-term student evaluations, almost 7 out of 7 for every course every semester. He has personally mentored in his lab already 23 undergraduates, taking them under his wing, so to speak. I could not resist. And he continues to support them in their own careers as scientists. And note this. His students have themselves published more than 40 papers on which he opted not to be an author. All of this, colleagues, by a junior faculty member. So for Professor Bowie, teaching and research go hand in hand, and his students, they notice this. Listen to one of his graduate students describing what he learned from his professor during collecting trips to Guatemala, and I'm quoting. He demonstrated to us that there's more to teaching than just lecturing, and more to research than just gathering data. Rather than being conflicting demands on his time, he made his research and teaching seem like complementary aspects of his life as a scholar. I'll mention 2 other characteristics that make Professor Bowie, I think, such a quintessentially excellent teacher. As he writes in his teaching statement, he strives to, quote, actively break down the perceived barrier between professor and student. And he does this in innumerable small ways. For example, by learning students' names, which they notice, and by asking them to call him Rory, which they enjoy. To give another example, one former student explained how honored he felt that, quote, despite feeling that I had so much to learn, I was invited to lab meetings and treated as a colleague whose opinion mattered. The second characteristic is generosity. Professor Bowie was once asked by a graduate student to teach a specialized course in Tanzania. This course could offer him little in the way of the usual inducements. He would need to use his own funds to pay to get there. His teaching efforts would not be compensated. The hours would be long. He would be away from his family. He would lose valuable time that he could dedicate to his research. And what did Professor Bowie do? He promptly agreed. It's noteworthy that in moving from South Africa to UC Berkeley, Rory made a commitment to continue to advance the education of African students. And he, in fact, serves as the advisor for a cadre of African students who will ultimately have a major impact in science and conservation in their home countries. So in an age when universities are attempting to have global footprints, Professor Bowie shows us how one professor does it and does it ethically. So to the students in the audience, I have some questions. Would you like to be able to learn to identify 150 bird species within the space of a semester? Yes? No. All right. Would you enjoy, when you see a bird that you once would have recognized only as a duck, would you enjoy being able to identify it as a bufflehead? No. All right. Or maybe you'd like to join your classmates in Tilden Park to await the sunrise and the sound of birds singing and be so inspired by this activity that you create your own independent research project on the study of owl calls. I know that you would. Well, if so, Rory Bowie is your professor. And if you seek out his classes, perhaps you too will say, as did one of his past students, he's the best prof in Berkeley. Thank you, Rory. Because of you, I love birds. I give you Berkeley Distinguished Teacher, Professor Rory Bowie.
To my fellow recipients, congratulations, and thank you very much for that generous introduction. It's a tremendous honor to be here, both at Berkeley and on the stage receiving this award. I was very young when I started teaching for the first time. In fact, I was only about a year older than most of the students in my classroom. My first teaching mentor, Jennifer Jarvis from the University of Cape Town, had the brilliant but terrifying idea to film my first lectures. Watching those lectures was a rather humbling experience, but it taught me two important things. The first was that I was never, ever again to wear shorts to a lecture. Because my knees shake so much, and boy, you should see them shaking now. The second is that teaching bright and engaged minds generates a level of energy that is both draining but incredibly invigorating. When I arrived at Berkeley 6 years ago from South Africa, I was grateful that I did not have to teach in my first year. It allowed me to establish my research program, and for somebody who had never been to California before, to learn about the amazing natural history of California. And thank you to Carla Cicero and Stephen Long, who have so generously taught me so much about Californian birds. Despite the wonderful welcome my wife and I received from colleagues in the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology in the Department of Integrative Biology, it wasn't until I started teaching the amazing undergraduate and graduate students at Berkeley that I felt truly part of the Berkeley community. How lucky can I be to teach a subject that I enjoy and treasure? My courses allow us to venture outside the classroom, not only to the laboratory, but to the field. Field courses have become a rare thing in higher education in North America. They're incredibly time-consuming, and I'm extremely proud that the Department of Integrative Biology continues to support such courses because they provide a truly wonderful forum for teaching. There's something special in being able to translate which may have been an abstract concept in the classroom to a vibrant personal experience in the field. If students gain the confidence to be able to challenge and ask me questions and thereby learn to think critically, then regardless of what subject matter they might remember a year later, I have achieved my goal. I would like to extend special thanks to my colleagues Jim McGuire and Alan Schabel. Their enthusiasm and friendship has made teaching our course so incredibly fun. And to my GSIs and graduate students, thank you for always exceeding my already demanding expectations. To Mary Power and John Hulsenbeck and your committee that prepared this nomination, thank you so very much. And to my students for writing letters. I'd also like to say a very special thank you to my beautiful wife, Verna, and son, Owen, who supported, encouraged, and put up with me being away for countless Saturdays and many weekends in the field with my students. I'd like to end by reading a few lines from a letter I received recently from a young lady I taught last year. To quote, "Thank you for the fantastic and life-changing experience known as IB-104. If not for IB-104, I'm not sure I would have ever noticed the ibises eating out of the trash cans in Sydney, or the rainbow lorikeets and sulfur-crested cockatoos flying around the cities here in Australia. Knowing what to look for around us has made the world even crazier but more exciting," end quote. What greater award could a professor ask for? Thank you.
I'm honored to introduce the next recipient of the Distinguished Teaching Award, Professor Darcy Grimaldo Grigsby from the History of Art Department. Professor Grigsby is a leading scholar of 19th century European painting, interested in particular in relationships between art, politics, and society. Her groundbreaking research has been motivated by an urgent desire to understand how art is shaped by revolution and empire, and how, in turn, art shapes our understanding of these extreme forms of political and social relation. Linking all of Professor Grigsby's work is an underlying fascination with the ways in which representational forms such as painting, sculpture, and photography work to produce or contest categories of race, gender, and sexuality. Her most recent book is on monumental projects that rose up out of the intersection between engineering, architecture, sculpture, and politics, the Suez and Panama Canals, the Statue of Liberty, and the Eiffel Tower. The title of this book, Colossal, could serve just as well as a description of Professor Grigsby's presence in the classroom and of her impact on students at every stage of undergraduate and graduate education. Our committee was impressed by her ability to make a 160-person introductory course on the history of Western art feel like a vibrant conversation. She moved around the lecture hall, asking questions, referring back to comments from previous classes, calling on students by name as she encouraged them to engage ever more deeply with images, many of which, like Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling paintings, are so familiar that they've become, ironically, difficult to see. With her wonderful ability to render the visual into language, this is the gift that Professor Grigsby offers her students, the chance to see even such familiar images again and to see them differently, within a broader political and art historical context, certainly, but also by attending to the details of bodies and of objects, to the angle of a foot or to the drape of a luminous fold of fabric. With her trademark good humor and sharp wit, Professor Grigsby makes sure that her students, many of whom have never taken a course in art history before walking into her classroom, feel empowered to break out of a mode of seeing grounded in reverential passivity. As one graduate student put it, regardless of how venerated a given painting may be, Darcy does not hesitate to express her honest thoughts. Whether she rhapsodizes over the effect of one painter's flickering brushwork or cringes at the use of pink by another, Darcy's candor draws graduate and undergraduate students alike into a world where art seems both vital and approachable. One of Professor Grigsby's former graduate students, now an associate professor of art history, describes another facet of this approach to art. What sets Grigsby apart, she writes, is her sense of sympathy. The artworks she so spellbindingly describes are presented as the products, typically, of human struggle, often over issues of race and identity, rather than of superhuman mastery. Again and again, Professor Grigsby's current and former students express their deep appreciation for her honesty, for all that she does to help them develop as researchers and writers, and to make it possible for them to pursue archival research all over the world. She inspires students, not only through her own brilliance, but also by her graceful ability to allow them to see themselves as intellectuals and critics, often for the first time. One former undergraduate who went on to do graduate work in art history writes, "As a minority, the elite world of French painting seemed inaccessible to me when I first took her course. But Professor Grigsby's passionate interrogation into new ways of thinking about the formal aspects of painting allowed me to see that my estrangement from canonical European artworks was not necessarily a barrier, it could also be an asset." A student who worked for Professor Grigsby as an undergraduate research assistant recalls being invited to a scholarly presentation of one of the book chapters with which she had assisted. "I rushed to the presentation from another class and arrived just after the talk was scheduled to begin. As I found a seat, Professor Grigsby looked up, smiled at me, and said, 'Wonderful, I was waiting for my collaborator to arrive.' It was a thrilling moment that remains with me to this day, and it was due to her faith in my abilities that I decided to pursue a scholarly career as a doctoral student." Of course, it's not only the students who go on to academic careers who find themselves transformed in Professor Grigsby's classroom. The enthusiasm expressed in her student evaluations shows just how powerful her teaching can be. One student writes, "I will carry the impact of this class and this professor with me through the rest of my education." Another, "Professor Grigsby is the single most influential professor I have ever had." And another, "Grigsby is one of those teachers I will remember for the rest of my life." Students don't just note the impact of studying with her, they describe the effects of her teaching with passion and with eloquence. As one puts it, She makes her students feel in their gut what is at stake with the subject matter at hand, and she makes all of it relevant to the issues we're dealing with every day. Another writes, "This course is more than about the history of art. It's about learning how to look at the world." Another, "I would recommend this course for anyone with a passion for art history and a desire to have their world reinvented every week." And one more, "She has made me feel empowered to look back at people who are looking at me." One student simply summed up Grigsby's class by writing, "She has turned a science nerd into an enamored art historian." I'd like to close with one final and I think particularly moving passage from a letter the committee received from a graduate student. "To say that Professor Grigsby is my role model is to render both sentimental and trite a human connection that forever changed the way I understand myself, my community, and my purpose in life. Studying with Darcy convinced me of the revolutionary power of education, and I will forever feel indebted to and humbled by her investments in me. Her kindness, patience, magnanimity, and compassion are all qualities I try to remember, especially now that I occasionally wear the teacher's hat. America desperately needs more educators like Darcy. I give you, UC Berkeley Distinguished Teacher, Darcy Grimaldo Grigsby."
How lovely. And how lovely to be introduced by Carl Brito. The life of scholar and teacher is a life of immense privilege. Even when tired and frayed, I daily appreciate how privileged I am to teach and mentor students, how lucky I am to be paid to think hard, to make the past vivid to the young and not so young, to speak and to listen across generational, social, economic, ethnic, and cultural differences, and to do so in a room together. How privileged we are to stare at a painting so still and so silent in this world of ever more restless technologies. Stillness and silence do not characterize our culture today, but in the classroom we have the opportunity to quiet the noise, to reduce the distractions, to invite attention, even if only briefly, to the complexity of our subjects, to find ways to speak about such fragile yet enduring testimonies from the past. Teaching is interactive. It requires sharing a space. For an art historian, it requires shared looking, listening, and conversing. Learning at its best is a collective act. It cannot happen online. Don't let these awards lull us into believing teaching is valued by those who would turn us, teachers and students alike, into a computer app. This public university under siege, this educational system in crisis needs to be defended. The classroom cannot, it should not become the prerogative solely of the wealthy, of the private Ivy League schools. Online education, to quote the recent faculty petition against Senate Bill 520, will not only lower academic standards, but will augment the educational divide along socioeconomic lines and diminish the ability for underrepresented minorities to excel in higher education. I speak from personal experience. My life and career attest to how very well public education once worked in the state of California. Much to my amazement, I have lived most of my life on this very campus. My Panamanian mother, Nora Grimaldo Walters, supported my sister and myself working as a secretary here. Some in this audience knew her. As children, my sister and I attended Berkeley's public schools and played in this campus's streams. I was an undergraduate here, and in the many years it took for me to overcome my belief that I belonged neither to the class or the gender or the whiteness of professors, I worked for the College of Letters and Science, evaluating transfer credits. When finally in 1995 I applied for my first job after doctoral studies, wondrously, I was offered a position here at the very institution that had mapped out the horizons of my daily life and represented for me, the daughter of an immigrant, the distant ideal of a life dedicated to intellectual inquiry and to justice. My path here was not confident nor direct, but hard-won, and managed around the birth and adoption of my beloved children, Gregoria and Pierre, and the ongoing medical challenges I have faced since 2004. I would not stand here but for the generosity of my remarkable husband and colleague in the history of art, Todd Olson, the rock-sturdy love of my amazing self-made sister, Lynn Grigsby, who now works as head of this campus's library applications and publishing. The sustenance and models of living provided by my friends and the support of my faculty, my chairs, Chris Hallett and Whitney Davis, and also especially Julia Bryan Wilson, who initiated this nomination, and our outstanding staff. Thank you, Linda and Bridget. I take this opportunity to thank the many graduate students who have been my intellectual interlocutors and who have also worked so very hard as graduate student instructors in my large lecture classes. This semester alone, I have depended on 5 graduate student instructors. Thank you, comrades. Your goodwill and humor keep me going. And finally, I thank the undergraduates, my youngest students, my advisees, my researchers through the invaluable URAP program. Tough, tender, curious, eager, and irreverent, these amazing young students, year in and year out, give my life purpose. It is an immense honor to be here today. Thank you, everyone.
I'm honored to introduce the next recipient of the Distinguished Teaching Award, Professor Timothy Hampton from the Departments of French and Comparative Literature. Professor Hampton is one of the most important scholars working today in the field of early modern European studies. His prize-winning books take on topics ranging from the place of exemplary historical figures within Renaissance writing to the relationship between literature and national identity in 16th century France, to the intersection between literary form and diplomatic culture in early modern Europe. Professor Hampton's graduate seminars on fascinating but notoriously difficult authors like Rabelais and Montaigne are always packed with students from multiple departments, and many a devoted modernist has emerged from his classroom transformed, reborn, as it were, as a Renaissance scholar. As one graduate student wrote to the committee, in his seminars, Tim can unravel dense Renaissance texts in a way that allows both specialists and newcomers to the early modern tradition to become absorbed in new intellectual experiences. It's often joked in our department that Tim Hampton has a magnetic pull on students interested in modern literature that drags them toward the Renaissance, if not for their entire graduate school careers, at least for a seminar, or 2, or 3. Another student writes, "The first class I took with him on Rabelais was so fascinating and so well taught, it made me seriously reconsider changing my entire field of study." But Professor Hampton's teaching interests are hardly limited to the early modern period. Our committee was astonished by the variety of his course offerings, as well as by their rigor and imagination. A course on vagabonds, strangers, and outlaws in French literature. Another on monsters, miracles, cannibals, and witches. Yet another on jazz culture in modern France. And then there was his recent freshman seminar on poetry and the senses, focusing on the irresistible pairing of the 19th century French poet Arthur Rimbaud and Bob Dylan. There's a real energy to his courses, intellectual energy to be sure, but also a creative spark and a kind of playfulness that gives students the confidence to engage with literary texts, not as fossilized great works, but rather as objects that are still alive, that can still speak to us, surprise us, amaze us. One former graduate student, currently an assistant professor of literature, wrote to us about his experience working as a GSI for Professor Hampton, and he put it this way. I taught a discussion section for his Shakespeare lecture, and I saw every week that those students were moved and amazed by his insightfulness and liveliness, his erudition and creativity. What an easy teaching experience that was for me, leading a conversation among students whose imaginations had been set aflame by Professor Hampton's lectures. A former undergraduate about to start a PhD program recalled Professor Hampton's particular blend of enthusiasm and brilliance. He approaches his subject matter with a contagious, almost giddy excitement that, when combined with his complete lack of pretension and awe-inspiring erudition, makes early modern Europe accessible and fascinating. Given all of this, it will hardly come as a surprise to hear that Professor Hampton's teaching evaluations are simply off the charts. Professor Hampton is completely awesome, writes one student in all caps, just to be sure to convey the intensity of the sentiment. There isn't one single thing I would change about him or this class. This has easily been the best course I have taken this semester, writes another student, and it will surely be one of the greatest I take at the university. And so they go one after another. Professor Hampton is a pearl of professionalism. He has an extremely keen mind that I swear is telepathic. He reads his students so well. A wonderful, wonderful professor. Every hour flew by like the breeze. A shining example of what makes an outstanding professor. It is because of him that I want to be a complet professor. For entirely selfish reasons, though, I think that the following might be my single favorite comment, if only because it offers up an affectionate appellation that has a real chance of catching on in the halls of Dwinell. This better be good. I love T-Hamp. Professor Hampton's dedication to the humanities at Berkeley is legendary. He is currently serving as the chair of French, but he's also a professor in comparative literature with an additional below-the-line appointment in Italian studies. He has served as the director of the Romance Languages and Literatures program. He's currently the director of the designated emphasis in early modern studies, and he's been instrumental in establishing a research program in diplomacy and culture at the Institute of International Studies. And yet, somehow, despite these commitments and so many others, he manages to make every student who comes by his office feel welcome. One undergraduate who, as a member of an underrepresented minority group, had the opportunity to work closely with Professor Hampton as a McNair scholar, wrote, "Even though I had already taken 2 classes with him, the dynamics of exchange between professor and student changed for me as I saw how his guidance was helping me find confidence not only in myself, but also in what I was doing. For someone who is planning to be a professor in the future, those experiences were foundational." I will close with one last passage written by a graduate student. It seems to me to capture beautifully the essence of Professor Hampton's openness, warmth, and engagement as a mentor and as a teacher. Despite the time that clearly goes into everything that Tim Hampton writes, or says, or does, it is his generosity that perhaps marks him the most. He is never too busy for a student, never too involved in his many projects to offer advice, lend a book from his personal library, to sit and listen to a paper pitch, or just to help work through a particularly difficult passage, even if it means digging out the Bible or a multi-volume Erasmus or an obscure doctoral thesis from the 1980s to consider alongside. There's never any ego, never any knowledge withheld to privilege his own work over that of his students. I give you, UC Berkeley Distinguished Teacher, Timothy Hampton.
Thanks very much. I am, if I wasn't giddy before, I'm certainly giddy now. But I am very honored indeed to be here, and particularly honored to have been introduced by my very esteemed and much valued colleague, Carl Brito. This semester I've been teaching an undergraduate comparative literature course on the Renaissance, and one of the themes that we've been exploring has been the theme of education. The ways in which many works of literature, as well as of political thought, are linked to the idea of teaching, of giving advice or giving counsel. One of the students pointed out to us recently in class discussion that many of the so-called teachers in the works we read are in fact quite problematic. Among other things, they tend to be prey to drunkenness, lechery, and cowardice. but that the students they teach seem to turn out just fine. Which of course brings to mind the important truth that we should all remember, which is that if you have great students, teaching will take care of itself. Nevertheless, I think it's worth saying a few words about the fabric of the classroom experience. I've been teaching at Berkeley for a few years now, and I've never failed to find an atmosphere of excitement in the classroom here. Teaching at Cal involves a unique blend of careful reading, disputation, and a kind of shared incandescence at the process of discovering the nuances of a work of the imagination. One of the causes of this, I think, is the awareness that all faculty come to that our teaching must be as much an art of listening as it is an art of speaking. The knowledge that the classroom will be a place of exchange and argument, in which everyone's voice will be given a space to be heard, generates a particular kind of collective engagement with the work of the class, as we push each other to be better, more responsible, more thoughtful, more creative readers of history, of literature, of art, and of the world around us. It's a precious kind of fire. You can't bottle it, you can't sell it on eBay. It happens in the moment. I'm convinced that the excitement that I find in the classroom is deeply linked to Berkeley's status as a public university. Berkeley's unique culture of openness and excellence makes it possible for the classroom to be a place of improvisation and innovation, where student and teacher are not afraid to be off balance, willing to challenge each other, to be both the changer and the changed. I mention this because I would not be here myself, either in this room this afternoon or even in this zip code area, if it were not for publicly supported higher education. I grew up in the desert in a town with one stoplight too. I grew up in the desert in a town with one stoplight. Neither of my parents went to college, nor did anyone they knew go to college. And if we thought about the future at all in my town, it involved getting a job on an oil rig, or perhaps going to Vietnam. Somehow I escaped that world and stumbled into a small humanities program at a public university. Not a university as good as Cal, mind you, but a decent place, clean and well-lighted, with a strong commitment to the liberal arts and a library that was open on the weekends. In a world like mine, where young people are channeled into what is falsely called vocational training, public higher education gave me and my friends the time and the encouragement, above all, to discover our calling. Close reading, critical analysis, and sustained reflection are not skills that come naturally to the human animal. They must be learned. And they are best learned in the open-ended, even-handed public classroom, where learning is shaped by the passions of the mind rather than the mysteries of privilege. I would like to thank Victoria Kahn and Michael Lucy for nominating me for the DTA. I would like especially to thank my wife, Jessica Levine, and my daughters, Emily and Sophia, for teaching me the importance of humor and imagination in both life and work. I would like to acknowledge the exceptionally high standards of teaching set by the faculty in arts and humanities on this campus. They remind me that any success I may have in the classroom is only a small part of a collective enterprise. Most especially, I would like to thank my students for teaching me something new every time we meet. As I have learned this semester yet again in my course on the Renaissance, if you have great students, the teaching will take care of itself. Thank you.
It's my honor to introduce the next recipient of the Distinguished Teaching Award, Terry Johnson. I have never, ever, ever in my time here at Cal had a professor as compassionate, witty, caring, and fantastic as Terry Johnson. He is what Cal and bioengineering are all about. I look forward to each class. If every professor were like you, people would never want to leave college. Terry's lectures were about 100 times more useful than the textbook. I seriously only use the textbook to look up constants. I enjoyed this class immensely. Terry does an excellent job of helping students find their inner engineer. Chill bro, smart guy, super social, great man, awesome ties, but cheesy jokes. You can win them all. Terry Johnson has taught for 12 years at Berkeley as a lecturer in the Department of Bioengineering. He's taught a variety of types of subjects and kinds of classes: cell biology labs, freshman introductory surveys, in-depth technical electives on laboratory instrumentation, challenging advanced courses in computer modeling and biomechanics and biological transport, and pedagogy and career development for graduate students. He has class sizes that often are over 100 students, and no one doubts the difficulty of the material he teaches, although one student commented that he feels Bioengineering 10 would be fun for anyone. Yet his courses are consistently over-enrolled, and the spaces are coveted. As one student noted, Terry's class is hard with an exclamation point, but a good kind of hard. Another commented, he's a great professor who makes the admittedly difficult material fun, or at least more understandable. Mr. Johnson came to Berkeley in 2001 when bioengineering was a new department with many majors but just a few FTE faculty. And when he came, the plan was that he would help to teach a few lab classes and assist with the delivery of a new course. But his talent and his commitment revealed themselves quickly, and then his teaching responsibilities grew and grew and grew. Terry became what one colleague describes as, without a doubt, the finest and the most inspirational teacher in our department, known for his exhaustive command of a spectrum of bioengineering topics, for his lucid lectures and fair tests, and his enthusiasm and vitality in the classroom. But his work went far beyond the classroom to include curriculum development, course creation, and program visioning. Just listen to a few of the other things he's done. He implemented a new undergraduate concentration in synthetic biology in collaboration with the Department of Chemical Engineering. As co-director, he founded the UC Berkeley UCSF Masters of Translation Medicine program. He designed a set of what have been characterized as sweeping changes in entry-level Bio-E classes in response to input from some 200 students whom he surveyed. He helped to restructure the department's freshman advising program, and he's the only lecturer in bioengineering to serve as an academic advisor to undergraduate students. He serves as a UC Berkeley advisor for the International Genetically Engineered Machines, or IGEM, competition, providing daily mentoring and lab instruction for a group of high school students and undergraduates, and then overseeing their projects and their presentations about their projects at a national competition. And he's served as mentor to graduate student instructors who've worked with him as he's developed or redesigned courses, and they've described how fortunate they feel to have had the chance to learn and teach beside him, as well as to pick his brain about their own research projects. But there's more still. And a lot of it is outside the realm of the technical and sometimes the academic. One student revealed, Terry is really the only teacher whom I felt comfortable enough to ask to write a letter of recommendation for an undergraduate research program. And by the way, that student was accepted. Wrote another, during the 6 months I spent as an iGymmer, Terry taught me a lot, but not only about synthetic biology and laboratory work, but also about being a strong team player. Now, this student, who's now a graduate student at another university, relayed a story about this very thing. Working on a project as an undergraduate with a team of other students, the student became embroiled in a heated argument about the sharing of data. Mr. Johnson diplomatically asked to speak to her in his office, and in the elevator ride on the way to his office, according to this student, she began to cry because she was stressed and frustrated with her teammates and their inability to reach a suitable compromise. Here's how she relayed what came next, and I'm quoting. Terry didn't say much immediately, but when we got to his office, he gave me a handful of tissues, and he explained very carefully that there would always be difficult people to work with in life. Good lesson for all of us. And it is a great skill to learn how to navigate people's personalities. He encouraged me to be more patient, simultaneously reprimanding me for getting angry with a team member and teaching me to be a better team player. Terry turned a fight into an opportunity to teach me a valuable life skill. And this is just one of many ways in which he is an excellent teacher, both academically and otherwise. He has a willingness to teach students about life in addition to science. Well, it will probably come as no surprise that Terry Johnson has already won awards for teaching. He's been voted the Bioengineering Honor Society Outstanding Instructor 3 times. In 2010, he won the Golden Apple, a student-initiated award given by undergraduates to honor those professors whom they will never forget because of their dedication to promoting a positive intellectual community at Cal. And there are other awards, too, that he's received. Well, it is indeed time for a UC Berkeley Distinguished Teaching Award to be added to that list. In fact, I think I'm ready to agree with the student who reflected, Terry is an excellent, perhaps perfect instructor. He is interesting, engaging, and effective, exceeding every quality I would want in an instructor without flaw. I give you Terry Johnson, lecturer in bioengineering, recipient of the 2013 Distinguished Teaching Award.
Well, you've seen the tie, so here's the jokes. Discoveries are precious. They require resource and great effort. To forget a discovery is a tragedy. To repeat a discovery is irritating, and as many of you know, probably not publishable. To be unable to discover and innovate because you've stopped training discoverers and innovators is a catastrophe. Teaching is, or one way of looking at teaching is, maintenance of the infrastructure of minds. And that's tricky because you can't do it alone. It is necessarily a collaboration. While you can lecture in an empty room, I don't recommend it, and I certainly wouldn't call it teaching. Teaching must involve a dedicated and receptive mind that is not your own. Berkeley is a place that attracts minds like those. Thanks to the excellence of the faculty and staff in my department, my college, and my campus, I find myself surrounded by keen and willing collaborators. If all of this sounds rather highfalutin, it boils down to this. In our respective fields, we train students to, quoting Scott McCloud, listen to everyone, follow no one, look for patterns, work like hell. Then we step back to let them make things better or stop other things from getting worse. I'd like to give you an example. After the bombing at last week's Boston Marathon, I went online to see and make sure that my friends there in Cambridge were safe. And I found that one of my former students was there treating victims of the blast, while another was rededicated to a graduate program developing better prosthetics during graduate school. I am deeply honored to receive this award and gratified to see so many of our students, having learned and grown here at Berkeley, go on to be utterly fantastic. Thank you very much.
Now it's my honor to introduce the final recipient of this year's Distinguished Teaching Award, Professor Eula Taylor. I have never, ever had a professor who was so excited to teach every single day. Loved the material, loved the presentation, loved Prof. Taylor. I remember always leaving her class feeling like my hand was going to fall off because I'd sat in lecture for nearly 2 hours attempting to write down everything she said because her lecture was so compelling that I wanted to keep a record of every last word. She is so incredibly heartfelt. She knows exactly how to motivate students. She was able to teach us to teach. Common sense said, I had no business being in Professor Taylor's class. The class was Slavery and African American Life before 1865. I was an ignorant white kid from rural California. What business did I have learning about African American history? Well, as it turned out, quite a bit of business. Professor Taylor is Associate Professor in the Department of African American Studies and an historian by training. Her research areas include Black feminist theory, civil rights and Black power, Pan-Africanism, and Black nationalism. And the book she's currently writing is on women and the Nation of Islam. She's responsible for several core courses, graduate and undergraduate, and teaches aspects of economic, political, and cultural African American history from colonial times to the present. Courses that prompt students to complain, why haven't we had this course before? But teaches, in relation to this professor, seems somehow too sedate, too weak a word to describe what Professor Taylor does in her lectures. Part of what is extraordinary about her teaching is the pure joy she takes in the act, in the moment of being in the classroom. As one former student wrote, many teachers are excited about their subject, but Eula is excited about sharing it. And as Professor Taylor wrote in her teaching statement, although teaching brings with it certain pressures, and she claims even now to feel nervous before each class, despite all this, she writes, it is when I am in the flow of my teaching rhythm that I feel most free. One colleague compared the way Professor Taylor orchestrates her lectures to the virtuosity of a jazz master. Another colleague said he left her lectures awed and moved, and he offered this detailed list of what she brings into the classroom every time she teaches. An unparalleled knowledge and understanding of her field, a striking ability to communicate not only the substance and the key points of her material, but also its richness and its importance, a passionate intensity and deep-seated commitment that commands students' attention and participation, and an energetic and engaging style of delivery that embraces and pushes forward probing dialogue. On end-of-semester evaluations, her students were more succinct, but just as impressed, and used words like the following to describe her lectures over and over again. Amazing, wonderful, dynamic, brilliant, engaging and funny, and inspirational. Her students' appreciation is all the more impressive given that many of the issues raised in her classes are challenging ones that cut to the core of students' own identities as they are immersed in charting their way through complex historical and current landscapes. The courses raise questions regarding race, gender, class, personal desire, and longings for intimacy and love. She insists that students be present, be in the moment for these difficult classroom conversations, and this sometimes requires asking students to turn off all of the electronic devices. She asks them to be present so that they can fully engage in the struggle that accompanies genuinely considering the perspectives of others. She calls this collective listening and believes it's in such moments of intense participation together that historical imagining and critical thinking can occur. But how does she make it possible for students to at once engage fully and at the same time that they risk much? Well, being able to share deep disciplinary knowledge is certainly part of it, and a unique lecturing style is too, but there's something more. I think of it as her ability, her willingness to bring her own humanity into the classroom. Professor Taylor models, through her interactions with students, tolerance, generosity, and inclusivity. And she's thereby able to create classrooms that are brimming full of critical but caring people, students who possess both academic strength and social tolerance. And it's this sense of connection, one human being to another, threading through her teaching and her relationships with her students, that makes academic success and engagement for many students possible and enjoyable, and that so inspires them. So remember the student whose comments I read at the top of this introduction, who wondered whether he, as a white kid from rural Cali, should even be taking an African American studies class. Well, he eventually went to speak to Professor Taylor about the conflicts he was feeling, and he says that the first thing she did was listen, and I'm quoting, "She acknowledged my conflicting feelings as completely valid and worth taking time to understand. Then she made it clear that I belonged in that classroom. It wasn't just that I should be in the class. Eula told me that I needed to be in the class. She made me feel that I belonged, and in so doing, showed that everyone belongs." A few years later, he delivered the valedictorian address for the African American Studies and African Diaspora Studies Black graduation. For this young man, by his own testimony, Professor Taylor was the single biggest influence on his development as a scholar, a professional, and a person. And so it's also been, I've become aware through the DTA process, for a remarkable number of other students. Now, this is high praise indeed, I know. But explaining such high praise, one student pointed out, it may sound like hyperbole, but it isn't. It's just Eula. It's just Eula, and Eula is in a league of her own. I give you UC Berkeley distinguished teacher, Professor Eula Taylor.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you so much. On behalf of the Department of African American Studies, we are so excited to be here with you. The last time we were here was in 1991. Our former colleague, the beloved literary scholar, Professor Barbara Christian, was the recipient of this award. Professor Christian was the first African American woman at Cal to receive this award, and she was also the first African American woman at Cal to earn tenure in 1978. I learned a lot about teaching from Professor Christian. She taught me that there was no substitute for intellectual passion and to prepare each class as if it was my last opportunity to teach. My other senior colleagues were equally significant in my professional life. I've been blessed to teach in the arms of elders, master teachers who at every turn gave me advice, listened to my concerns, and empowered me when I doubted my own ability to teach. Professor Albert Johnson, I witnessed his far-reaching implications of his generosity. He taught film in our department, and he exposed me to obscure clips. He was the U2 of his day, and he assisted me in my teaching in locating visuals that I continue to use. Professor June Jordan was a poetic dynamo who role modeled how to work with assistants. Her GSIs respected her because she trusted that they could fully absorb everything that was essential. I've worked with some amazing GSIs over the years, and it is my hope that they have always felt supported. Professor Veve Clark, I'm sorry, that's my granddaughter crying, I'm sorry, okay? I know her voice. Professor Veve Clark taught me so much, so very, very much, and I must tell you, I've been weepy all day because I wish she was here. Professor Veve Clark taught me so much because she was so impassioned about everything that she did, but what she most exposed me to was the importance of creating a strong infrastructure. My students have witnessed my notes, both typed and written. They are a blueprint that keep me on track for my teaching goals. All four of my colleagues that I just mentioned have all passed away. but I pray that my students see a little bit of each of them in me every time I come into class. Professor Roy Thomas, who retired in 1993, was the department's master teacher. In fact, if you ask anyone who was at Cal before 1993, the teacher that they most likely will always mention is Professor Roy Thomas. Professor Roy Thomas educated me on the fact that students want to see our full selves in the classroom. Honesty exposes our vulnerabilities and our willingness to learn and our willingness to grow. My students know when I've read a new book, and my students also know when I'm having a hot flash. Clearly, I've had the privilege to embrace the art of teaching in the best African American studies on the planet. Our department is amazing. My colleagues are brilliant scholars and teachers, and we're still supported by a stellar staff and inspiring graduate students. I want to thank my husband, who has gone to sleep for years every night, Sunday night and Tuesday night, the nights that I'm prepping, with a strong light on over his head because I am reading, and he never complains. Thank you, Giovanni. I also want to say that I'm so proud to be in a department that is committed to teaching excellence. And I'm so glad that so many Cal undergraduate students, particularly our African American Studies majors, enroll in our courses and understand the academic significance of African American Studies, understands the significance of African American Studies to knowledge, to intellectual growth, and to humanity as a whole. Thank you so much.
And now, I'd like to introduce Karen Clancy, who is president of the California Alumni Association.
It's an honor for me to be here to offer congratulations to our award winners today. This is really a time for us to celebrate the contributions of 5 extraordinary individuals. Since 1872, the Cal Alumni Association has advanced and promoted the interests of the University of California, Berkeley by connecting alumni with each other and to our alma mater. We are proud to have graduated from the world's top public university with a reputation for excellence in research and excellence in teaching. This excellence in teaching is what connects alumni back to the campus many years later. We recently honored an Alumnus of the Year, Frank Davis, who received his PhD from Cal in 1955 in biochemistry. At the age of 92, Dr. Davis still recalls his experience in Berkeley. He told us that the quality of teaching was exceptional and that he knew his instructors were offering him an education that would give him an edge for the rest of his career. And based on the career that he had, it gave him quite an edge. To our distinguished teachers here today, thank you for giving us the edge. Thank you for your dedication to the profession and your ability to engage and inspire the next generation of leaders. You are truly the best of the best. And one of the things that I think I learned from all of the comments that were read to introduce you is that one of the skills that you have as being a distinguished teacher is that we know that your students are learning. So thank you very much for that. On behalf of the Alumni Association, I wish to present you with a letter of congratulations and a special invitation from our Cal Discoveries Travel Group. So congratulations and fiat lux.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much. So, I would like to ask our 2013 UC Berkeley Distinguished Teachers to stand once more and let us congratulate you again. There are, I'm pleased to note, other distinguished teachers in the House. Previous recipients of the Distinguished Teaching Award, could you please stand so that we can recognize you also? And previous recipients of the award, please join these new recipients on stage after the ceremony for our annual photograph. All right. This has been a joyful celebration of excellent teaching, and there are people and organizations to thank for making this event possible. Vice Provost Kathy Koshland and her Office of Teaching, Learning, and Academic Planning and Facilities. Richard Freistadt and Melanie Green from the Center for Teaching and Learning. And Educational Technology Services and CAL Performances. Our ceremony has concluded, but not our celebration. Please join the recipients of the Distinguished Teaching Award at a reception just across the way at the Alumni House. It will begin immediately. Thank you so much for coming, and good evening.